The rain came down in sheets so thick that Claire Donovan could barely see the yellow line dividing the highway. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, and the wipers scraped across the windshield in a rhythm that matched the pounding in her chest. In the rearview mirror, 2 battered suitcases sat in the back seat like silent witnesses to everything she'd left behind. No furniture, no photo albums, no wedding china carefully wrapped in newspaper, just clothes, a few books, and a jewelry box she hadn't opened in 3 months because the sight of her wedding ring made her physically ill. She had been driving for 11 hours straight, stopping only twice for gas and burnt coffee that tasted like regret. The rental car smelled like artificial pine and someone else's cigarette smoke, and every mile that stretched between her and North Carolina felt like both an escape and a slow drowning. The GPS voice kept reciting distances in that calm, mechanical tone, as if crossing an entire country with nothing but 2 suitcases was the most normal thing in the world, as if women did this every day, as if hearts didn't shatter so completely that you had to physically remove yourself from everything familiar just to remember how to breathe. Claire's phone buzzed in the cup holder for the 14th time that day. She didn't look at it. She knew it was her sister, Emma, checking in again with that careful voice people use when they think you might be about to do something irreversible. But what Emma didn't understand, what nobody seemed to understand, was that Claire had already done the irreversible thing. She'd walked away from 8 years of marriage, a job she loved, a house she'd painted room by room, and a life that looked perfect in photographs, but felt like slow suffocation when the door closed at night. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, cutting through mountains she couldn't see in the dark and rain. Somewhere out there, 3,000 miles from everything she knew, was a town called Bend, a town she'd chosen by closing her eyes and scrolling through job listings until her finger landed on something that felt far enough away. A teaching position at a small elementary school, a trailer on the property where she could live rent-free for the first 6 months. It wasn't much. It was barely anything, but it was hers, and that was more than she could say about anything in the life she'd just abandoned. Her mind kept circling back to that moment, the one she couldn't stop replaying no matter how many miles she put between herself and it. The sound of laughter coming from behind a half-open bedroom door, the way her hand had frozen on the doorknob, the way everything inside her had gone completely silent, as if her body knew before her brain did that what came next would change everything. She hadn't screamed, hadn't thrown things, hadn't collapsed in the doorway like women did in movies. She'd simply backed away, walked down the stairs with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, gotten into her car, and sat there in the driveway for 45 minutes without turning on the engine. The rain intensified, and Claire eased her foot off the gas. A semi-truck roared past, sending up a wave of water that momentarily blinded her. Her heart hammered. For a split second, she thought about pulling over, about calling Emma back, about admitting that maybe this was insane, that maybe running across the country to a place where she knew absolutely no one was the kind of decision people made when they were broken beyond repair. But then she remembered Ryan's face the next morning when she'd finally confronted him, the way he'd looked at her with something worse than guilt, with irritation, as if she'd interrupted something, as if 8 years of marriage, of waking up beside each other, of planning a future that would never happen, was nothing more than an inconvenience he'd been waiting to shed. He'd already packed a bag, already rented an apartment across town, already decided she wasn't worth fighting for. So, no, she wouldn't pull over. She wouldn't turn back, because the only thing more terrifying than starting over with nothing was staying in a place where she'd become invisible. The GPS announced she had 417 miles left to go. Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, though she couldn't tell anymore if it was tears or just exhaustion, and pressed harder on the gas. Somewhere ahead, in a town she'd never seen, with people she'd never met, there had to be something better than this. There had to be. And if you believe that sometimes the only way forward is to leave everything behind, stay with me. Because what Claire didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly see through the rain and the heartbreak and the terrible silence of that car, was that she was driving toward the most important person she would ever meet. If you'd asked anyone in Greenfield, North Carolina about Claire and Ryan Donovan, they would have told you the same thing. Perfect couple. High school sweethearts who'd actually made it work. The kind of marriage that made single people feel hopeful and divorced people feel bitter. Claire taught 3rd grade at Maple Grove Elementary, where the kids adored her and parents requested her classroom every year. Ryan managed Davidson Auto Sales, wore suits that fit well, and had the kind of easy charm that made people trust him with their money. They lived in a small brick ranch on Sycamore Street, with a front porch that Claire had painted white herself, planting geraniums in terracotta pots every spring like she was building something permanent. Their mornings had a rhythm. Ryan woke first, started the coffee, brought her a cup while she was still pulling her hair into the messy bun she wore to work. He'd kiss her forehead, say something about dinner plans, and she'd watch him leave through the kitchen window, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile easy. She'd believed in that smile for 8 years, believed in the way he'd hold her hand at the movies, the way he'd surprise her with takeout from her favorite Chinese place, the way he'd say, "I love you," every night before they turned off the lights, like it was a promise that would never expire. But there were cracks, small ones, that Claire had learned to ignore because acknowledging them felt like inviting disaster. The way Ryan's phone was always face down on the table, the way he'd started working late 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, the way sex had become something scheduled, perfunctory, like checking off a box on a list neither of them wanted to admit they were keeping. Claire told herself it was normal, that all marriages went through phases, that the passion they'd had at 22 couldn't be expected to burn the same way at 34. She'd wanted a baby. God, she'd wanted a baby so badly it felt like a physical ache sometimes. She'd bring it up gently over dinner, show him nursery ideas on Pinterest, mention how her friend Jessica's daughter had just started walking. Ryan would nod, say, "Soon," say, "Let's wait until we're more financially stable," say, "I want to make sure we're ready," and Claire would swallow the disappointment, trust that he meant it, believe that their someday was coming. The Facebook photos told a different story than the one Claire was living, but she didn't realize that until much later. There they were at Emma's wedding, dancing under string lights, Claire in a blue dress that made her eyes look bright, Ryan's arm around her waist. There they were on vacation in Charleston, sitting on a bench overlooking the harbor, his hand on her knee. There they were at the annual 4th of July barbecue, both holding beers and laughing at something someone had said. From the outside, it looked like love. From the inside, it felt like Claire was performing in a play, where only she didn't know the ending had already been written. Their house was small, but she'd made it beautiful. Cream-colored curtains she'd sewn herself, a gallery wall of their wedding photos and trips they'd taken, a bookshelf filled with novels she'd read, and Ryan had promised to get to someday. The bedroom had pale yellow walls, because Claire loved waking up to something that felt like sunlight, and Ryan had helped her paint it one Saturday, getting more paint on himself than the walls, both of them laughing and kissing between roller strokes. That was 4 years ago, back when touching still felt easy. She remembered the last normal evening before everything imploded. It was a Tuesday, in late September. Claire had made spaghetti, Ryan's favorite, and they'd eaten in front of the television watching a crime documentary neither of them really cared about. He'd mentioned something about a big sale coming through at work, about maybe taking a weekend trip to the mountains if it closed. Claire had felt a flutter of hope, thinking maybe this was the turning point. Maybe they were coming out of whatever rough patch they'd been stuck in. He'd kissed her goodnight, told her he loved her, turned off the lamp on his nightside table and rolled over, asleep within minutes while Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why she felt so alone in a bed she shared with another person. She'd ignored so many signs because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that the life she'd built, the future she'd imagined, the person she'd chosen at 22, might not be who she thought he was, and Claire had never been good at giving up on things. She'd stayed late after school to help struggling students. She'd nursed her mother through cancer treatments 3 years ago. She'd repainted the porch twice when the first coat peeled. She didn't quit. She fixed things. She believed that love was something you worked at, something you chose every day even when it got hard. But what Claire didn't understand yet, what she wouldn't understand until she walked up those stairs and opened that door, was that some things can't be fixed. Some betrayals are so complete, so deliberate, that all the hope and effort and determination in the world can't put the pieces back together. And the worst part, the part that would haunt her for months afterward, was that she'd had no idea. None. She'd kissed him goodbye that morning, made him coffee, believed in their someday. Claire had left school early that Wednesday because the parent-teacher conferences scheduled for the afternoon had been postponed. Principal Morris sent out an email at noon saying the heating system had failed and they needed to reschedule. Claire felt a small spark of relief. She could go home, take a bath, maybe start the new novel sitting on her nightstand. Maybe she'd surprise Ryan by cooking something special for dinner. Maybe tonight would be one of those nights where they actually talked, where the distance between them shrunk just enough to remember why they'd chosen each other in the first place. She pulled into the driveway at 2:15, noting that Ryan's truck was there, which was unusual, but not alarming. Maybe he'd come home for lunch and decided to work from the house. He did that sometimes, spreading paperwork across the kitchen table, taking calls in that smooth voice he used with customers. Claire grabbed her bag from the passenger seat and walked up the porch steps, her keys jingling in her hand. The geraniums needed watering. She made a mental note to do that after she changed out of her work clothes. The house was quiet when she stepped inside. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but something heavier. Something that made her pause in the entryway with her hand still on the doorknob. The television wasn't on. No music playing. No sounds of Ryan typing on his laptop or talking on the phone. Just silence. Thick and strange. Settling over everything like dust. Claire set her bag down on the small table by the door, her teaching materials making a soft thud against the wood. She called his name once. Her voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No answer. She walked through the living room, past the couch where they'd sat just last night watching television in that companionable silence that had replaced actual conversation somewhere along the way. The kitchen was empty, dishes from breakfast still in the sink, because she'd been running late that morning. Claire felt her heartbeat pick up slightly, though she couldn't have explained why. Nothing was wrong. Everything looked normal, except it didn't feel normal. The stairs creaked under her feet the way they always did, the third step from the bottom making that particular groan that Ryan kept saying he'd fix but never did. Claire climbed slowly, one hand trailing along the banister she'd wiped down just 2 days ago. She could hear something now, faint, coming from upstairs. Voices. Laughter. The soft murmur of conversation that made her steps slow even further. The bedroom door was halfway open. Not closed. Not all the way open. Just enough that Claire could see a slice of the room through the gap. The yellow walls she'd painted. The corner of their bed with its white duvet. A woman's shoe on the floor. Black with a heel. Definitely not hers. Claire's hand reached for the doorknob but didn't push it. Her entire body had gone still in a way that felt disconnected from conscious thought. Like some ancient part of her brain had registered danger and shut down all unnecessary systems. She heard Ryan's laugh. Not the polite one he used with strangers, or the tired one he used with her lately, but real laughter, warm and genuine and completely unguarded. Then a woman's voice, familiar in a way that made Claire's stomach drop. "You're terrible," the voice said, playful, intimate. What if she comes home? And Ryan's response, so casual it felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. "She won't. She's got conferences until 6. Claire pushed the door open the rest of the way. She didn't mean to. Her hand just moved, and suddenly she was looking directly into her own bedroom, at her own husband sitting on their bed in his undershirt and dress pants, and Melissa Crawford from his office sitting beside him in a blouse Claire recognized from the Christmas party last year. They weren't having sex. Somehow that made it worse. They were just sitting there, comfortable and relaxed, Melissa's hand on Ryan's thigh, both of them looking at something on his phone, smiling at a private joke Claire would never be part of. Ryan's head turned first. His eyes met Claire's, and for one horrible, elongated second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The moment stretched out like taffy, sticky and impossible to break free from. Claire watched his face cycle through expressions so quickly she couldn't catalog them all. Surprise. Then calculation. Then something that looked almost like annoyance, as if she'd interrupted something important, rather than walked into her own bedroom to find her marriage disintegrating in real time. Melissa pulled her hand back slowly, but she didn't look particularly ashamed. More awkward, like she'd been caught in a social faux pas, rather than actively participating in the destruction of another woman's life. She glanced at Ryan as if waiting for him to handle this, to explain, to make it make sense. Claire's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her brain was trying to process too many things at once. The shoe on the floor, the unmade bed, the way Ryan's collar was unbuttoned, the fact that Melissa's lipstick was slightly smudged. How many times had this happened? How many afternoons had Claire been at work, teaching children their multiplication tables, while Ryan brought another woman into their bed, into the room with the yellow walls she'd chosen because they made her happy? She took one step backward, then another. Ryan stood up, started to say something, but Claire was already turning away, already moving back toward the stairs on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. She didn't run, didn't slam doors or throw things or scream the way she would later wish she had. She just walked down the stairs, past the living room with its gallery wall of lies, past the kitchen where she'd made him coffee that morning, and out the front door into the September sunshine that suddenly felt like it belonged to a different world entirely. Claire sat in her car in the driveway for 45 minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there with her hands in her lap, staring at the porch she'd painted white, at the geraniums that still needed watering. At the door, Ryan didn't come through to explain or apologize or beg her to stay. Claire spent that night at a Holiday Inn off the interstate, paying for the room with a credit card she never used, the one she kept for emergencies. She supposed this qualified. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and had a painting of a lighthouse bolted to the wall above the bed. She lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, staring at the popcorn ceiling, her phone buzzing every 20 minutes with calls and texts she didn't answer. Ryan, Emma, Ryan again. A number she didn't recognize that might have been Melissa. The phone would light up, vibrate against the nightstand, then go dark. Over and over until Claire finally turned it off completely, somewhere around 3 a.m. She went home the next day because she didn't know where else to go. Her car pulled into the driveway on autopilot, her body going through motions while her mind felt wrapped in cotton. Ryan's truck was there. Of course it was. Where else would he be? She found him in the kitchen making coffee, still in his pajama pants and a t-shirt, looking rumpled and tired, but not particularly devastated. That's what struck her first. How normal he looked. How the world hadn't ended for him the way it had for her. He turned when she came in, and there was something in his face she'd never seen before. Not quite guilt. Something closer to resignation. Like he'd been caught doing something he'd always planned on doing eventually anyway. "Claire," he said, setting down the coffee mug. "We need to talk." She stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, the kitchen where she'd made thousands of meals, where they'd had countless ordinary conversations about ordinary things, and felt like a stranger in her own life. "How long?" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. She'd expected it to shake. Ryan ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she'd always found endearing that now just looked like a tell, like he was buying time to construct the right answer. "Does it matter?" "How long, Ryan?" He sighed, leaned back against the counter. 6 months, maybe 7. I don't know exactly when it started. 6 months. Claire did the math in her head. That was before summer, before their anniversary dinner at that Italian place where he'd held her hand across the table, before the beach weekend where she'd felt for one brief moment like maybe they were going to be okay. "And you didn't think I deserved to know?" "I was going to tell you." He said it like he believed it, like he'd actually convinced himself this was true. "I just didn't know how. And then it just kept going and it got harder to stop. So instead you let me wake up next to you every morning, make you coffee, plan a future with you, while you were sleeping with someone else. It wasn't just about sex." Ryan's jaw tightened, and Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement, at the fact that he seemed to think this clarification made things better somehow. "Melissa and I, we connect. We understand each other. She doesn't put pressure on me about kids or the future or all the things you're always pushing for." There it was. The shift she'd been waiting for without knowing it. The moment where somehow this became her fault. Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. "So you cheated on me because I wanted to have a baby with you?" "I didn't cheat because of that. I cheated because we don't work anymore, Claire. We haven't for a long time. You're so focused on this perfect life you think we're supposed to have that you can't see we're not happy. I'm not happy." She wanted to scream at him that she wasn't happy either, that she'd been drowning in this marriage for months, that she'd just been too loyal or too stupid or too hopeful to admit it. But what came out instead was quieter, more defeated. "So what now?" Ryan looked away, and in that gesture Claire saw everything she needed to know. He'd already made decisions, already planned his exit. "I got an apartment. Over on Riverside. I'm moving my stuff this weekend. You already have an apartment. It wasn't a question. I signed the lease 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. While she'd been making dinner and grading papers and sleeping beside him, he'd been preparing to leave. Had probably been packing boxes mentally, sorting through their life together and deciding what he wanted to keep and what he was willing to abandon. The house is in your name, she heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and mechanical. Yeah, I talked to a lawyer already. You'll need to be out by the end of the month. Claire looked at him, really looked at him, and realized she was staring at a stranger. How had she not seen this? How had she lived with this person, shared a bed with him, built a life around him, and not noticed that he'd become someone capable of this kind of calculated cruelty? You talked to a lawyer before you talked to me. I'm sorry. He said it without conviction, checking a box on the list of things he was supposed to say. I know this is hard, but we'll both be happier this way. You'll see. The rage came then, sudden and overwhelming, rising up from somewhere deep in her chest. Don't you dare tell me how I'm going to feel. Don't you dare stand there and act like you're doing me some kind of favor by destroying our marriage and kicking me out of my own home. It's not your home, Claire. It's my house. My name is on everything. And there it was, the final blow. 8 years reduced to property rights and signatures on documents. Claire realized then that she had nothing. No house. No savings account in her name. No safety net. She'd trusted him completely. Let him handle the finances while she focused on her students and their life together. And now she was standing in a kitchen that wasn't hers. In a marriage that had been over for months without her knowledge. Staring at a man who looked irritated that she wasn't making this easier for him. She left that night and drove to her sister Emma's apartment across town. 2 hastily packed suitcases in her trunk and nowhere else to go. Emma opened the door, took one look at Claire's face, and pulled her inside without asking questions. Claire slept on Emma's couch for 2 weeks, waking up each morning to the sounds of her sister getting ready for work, feeling like a burden and a failure, and someone who'd somehow sleepwalked through her own life. The couch at Emma's apartment was a hand-me-down from their mother's house, forest green with worn cushions that sagged in the middle and smelled faintly of lavender detergent. Claire had spent 14 nights on that couch, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sounds of her sister's life happening in the bedroom down the hall. Emma's alarm at 6:30, the shower running, coffee brewing. The careful quietness of someone trying not to wake a guest who wasn't really a guest, but didn't have anywhere else to be. Claire knew she was overstaying her welcome even though Emma would never say it. She could see it in the way her sister hesitated before bringing someone home, in the apologetic look she'd give before disappearing into her bedroom with her boyfriend, in the careful way she'd ask if Claire needed anything, as if Claire were sick rather than simply broken. During the day, while Emma was at work, Claire would sit on the couch scrolling through apartment listings she couldn't afford on a teacher's salary, trying to figure out how she'd ended up 34 years old with no money, no home, and no idea how to rebuild a life she'd thought was permanent. Greenfield felt like it was suffocating her. Everywhere she went, there were reminders. The grocery store where she and Ryan had shopped every Sunday. The movie theater where they'd seen their first date film. The street corner where he'd proposed on one knee with a ring she'd later learn he'd bought on a payment plan he was still paying off when he left her. Worse were the people. Former friends who'd chosen sides or simply disappeared. Parents of her students who looked at her with pity. The inevitable run-ins at the coffee shop or the library, where she'd see someone from Ryan's office and have to pretend she was fine, that she wasn't falling apart in slow motion. The night everything changed was a Thursday. Claire woke at 3 a.m. from a dream she couldn't remember, her heart pounding and her throat tight. Emma's apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Claire lay there in the darkness, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, and felt something shift inside her. Not hope, exactly. Something harder and more desperate. A kind of clarity that felt like falling. She got up, found her laptop on the kitchen table, and opened it in the blue glow of the screen. Her fingers moved almost without conscious thought, typing words into the search bar. Teaching jobs out of state. Remote locations. Fresh start. The results loaded slowly. Page after page of possibilities in places she'd never been. Towns with names she had to look up on a map. Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, Alaska. places so far from North Carolina that no one would know her story, where she could walk into a grocery store without wondering if the person in line behind her had heard about what happened. She clicked through listings mechanically, most of them requiring certifications she didn't have, or offering salaries that wouldn't cover rent. But then, buried on the third page of results, she found it. Cascade View Elementary School in Bend, Oregon. 4th grade teacher needed immediately to replace a staff member on medical leave. Housing provided. A trailer on the school property, rent-free for 6 months while she got settled. The salary was modest, but livable. The photos showed a small brick building surrounded by pine trees and mountains, everything covered in that kind of pristine natural beauty that looked nothing like the flat, humid landscape of home. Claire stared at the posting for a long time. Oregon was 3,000 miles away. She'd never been west of Tennessee. She knew exactly 3 things about Bend. It was in the mountains, it snowed there, and it was about as far from Greenfield as she could get without leaving the country. She clicked on the application link before she could talk herself out of it, her fingers trembling slightly as she filled in the fields. Education history, teaching experience, references. At the bottom there was a box asking why she was interested in relocating. Claire typed 1 sentence. "I'm ready for a fresh start in a new place." She hit submit at 3:42 in the morning and immediately wanted to take it back. But she didn't. She closed the laptop, went back to the couch, and lay there until dawn, trying to imagine what it would feel like to simply disappear from her own life, to walk away from everything familiar and start over in a place where nobody knew her as Ryan Donovan's ex-wife, as the woman who'd been too blind to see what was happening in her own marriage. The idea terrified her. It also felt like the only thing that made sense. The call came 3 days later while Claire was folding laundry in Emma's living room. A woman named Patricia Holbrook, principal of Cascade View Elementary, with a voice that sounded warm and no nonsense at the same time. They talked for 30 minutes about curriculum and teaching philosophy and what Claire was looking for in a new position. At the end of the call, Patricia said, "I'm going to be honest with you, Claire. We need someone who can commit to being here, not someone who's running away from something and going to leave the minute things get hard." Claire could have lied, could have given some polished answer about professional growth and new challenges. Instead, she said, "I am running away from something. My marriage ended badly and I need to leave this town. But I'm a good teacher. I show up. I care about my students. And I promise you, if you give me this job, I'll stay." There was a pause. Then Patricia said, "When can you start?" Claire gave her 2 weeks' notice at Maple Grove Elementary the next morning. Principal Morris looked concerned and asked if she was sure about this, if maybe she needed some time to think things through. But Claire was already gone in her mind, already packing boxes and making lists and researching what kind of winter coat you needed for Oregon. She told Emma over dinner that night, watching her sister's face cycle through shock and worry, and finally reluctant understanding. "Oregon," Emma said slowly, setting down her fork. "You're really going to move across the country to a place you've never seen?" "Yes." "What if you hate it?" "Then I'll hate it somewhere Ryan isn't." Emma reached across the table and took Claire's hand. "I'm going to miss you so much." "I know." Claire squeezed back, feeling tears prick her eyes for the first time in days. "But I can't stay here, Em. Every single thing in this town reminds me of him. I need to go somewhere where I can just be me, not the sad divorced teacher everyone feels sorry for." So she bought a one-way plane ticket, sorted through her belongings and realized how little of it actually mattered, packed 2 suitcases with clothes and books, and a few photographs that didn't include Ryan. On her last night in Emma's apartment, she lay on that sagging green couch and tried to feel something about leaving. Fear, maybe, or regret. But all she felt was a strange, hollow relief, like she was finally allowed to stop pretending everything was going to be okay. The plane touched down in Redmond just after noon on a Tuesday in late October, the sky so blue and clear it hurt to look at after the perpetual humidity of North Carolina. Claire had never seen mountains like this, sharp and snow-capped against the horizon, making everything feel both impossibly vast and strangely intimate. She collected her 2 suitcases from baggage claim, rented the cheapest car available, and drove the 40 minutes to Bend with the windows cracked, letting the cold, pine-scented air fill the car and her lungs. The town was smaller than she'd expected. One main street with coffee shops and outdoor gear stores and restaurants with names like The Blacksmith and Jackson's Corner. People walked around in fleece and hiking boots like it was a uniform. Everything looked aggressively healthy and outdoorsy in a way that made Claire, in her Target jeans and cardigan, feel distinctly out of place. She drove through town following the GPS directions to Cascade View Elementary, her stomach tight with nervousness and something that might have been anticipation if she'd let herself feel it. The school sat on the edge of town, surrounded by ponderosa pines and backed by mountains that looked like something out of a postcard. It was smaller than Maple Grove, single-story brick with a playground and a fenced field where a few kids were playing soccer, despite the October chill. Claire pulled into the gravel parking lot and sat there for a moment, her hand still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process that this was real, that she'd actually done this, that somewhere behind that building was a trailer where she was supposed to live, to sleep, to figure out how to be a person again. Patricia Holbrook met her in the school office, a woman in her late 50s with gray hair pulled into a practical bun and eyes that looked like they didn't miss much. She shook Claire's hand firmly, asked about her flight, and then walked her around back to what would be her new home. The trailer sat in a clearing about 50 yards from the main building, surrounded by tall grass that needed cutting and a few scraggly bushes. It was smaller than Claire had imagined, an old single-wide that had seen better days, with rust stains streaking the white siding, and a small wooden porch that looked like it might collapse if you stepped on it wrong. "I know it's not much," Patricia said, unlocking the door, "but it's clean and the heat works. Previous teacher who lived here left about 6 months ago. We've been using it for storage mostly." Claire stepped inside, and the smell hit her first. Mildew and dust, and the particular mustiness of a space that had been closed up too long. The interior was one long, narrow space, a tiny kitchen with laminate counters and appliances that looked like they were from the 90s, a living area with a built-in couch that had seen better days. At the far end, a bedroom barely big enough for a double bed and a closet. The bathroom was the size of an airplane lavatory. Everything was beige and worn and depressing in a way that made Claire's chest feel tight. "Take the rest of the day to settle in," Patricia said, handing her a key. "School starts at 8 tomorrow. I'll introduce you to your class then." She paused at the door, looking back at Claire with an expression that might have been sympathy. It gets easier. Being somewhere new. Give it time. Then she was gone, and Claire was alone in a trailer that smelled like abandonment, 3,000 miles from everything she'd ever known. She set her suitcases down and just stood there in the middle of the narrow space, feeling the weight of what she'd done settle over her like a physical thing. This was insane. She'd moved across the country to live in a trailer behind an elementary school in a town where she didn't know a single person, where winters got so cold you needed special tires on your car, where everyone seemed to hike and ski and do outdoor things she had no interest in. Claire walked into the tiny bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. Her face looked pale and tired, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that desperately needed washing. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd run away from her life and had no idea what came next. The first night was the worst. Claire tried to sleep, but the trailer made strange noises, settling sounds and creaks that she wasn't used to. The heating system clanked on and off with alarming irregularity. Through the thin walls, she could hear wind moving through the pine trees, an endless susurration that sounded like whispers. She lay on the bare mattress, too tired to make up the bed with the sheets she'd packed, staring at a ceiling stained with water damage and wondering what the hell she'd been thinking. At some point after midnight, the enormity of it hit her. She was completely alone, more alone than she'd ever been in her life. At least in Greenfield she'd had Emma, had familiar streets and routines, and the strange comfort of sleeping in a place where she knew where everything was. Here, she had nothing. 2 suitcases of belongings, a job teaching children she'd never met, a trailer that smelled like failure, and 3,000 miles between her and anything that resembled home. Claire rolled onto her side, and finally, for the first time since finding Ryan with Melissa, she let herself completely break down. Not the quiet, controlled crying she'd done in her car or on Emma's couch. Full, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, the kind of grief that felt like it might tear her apart. She cried for her marriage, for the future she'd planned that would never happen, for the version of herself who'd been stupid enough to believe that love was enough, for the fact that at 34, she was starting over with nothing in a place so foreign it might as well have been another country. The crying eventually exhausted itself, and Claire lay there in the darkness, completely spent, feeling hollowed out and strangely empty. Outside, the wind kept moving through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of traffic on the highway. The trailer settled around her with another groan of old metal and wood, and slowly, without her noticing exactly when it happened, she fell asleep. Claire woke on her first morning in Bend to the sound of hammering. For a disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, her mind still caught between sleep and the dream she'd been having about her old classroom in North Carolina. Then reality crashed back. The unfamiliar ceiling, the musty smell, the cold air seeping through gaps she hadn't noticed the night before. She pulled herself upright on the bare mattress, her body aching from crying and the uncomfortable sleeping position, and tried to locate the source of the noise. Through the small window above the built-in couch, she could see a figure crouched on the trailer's front porch. A man in a faded flannel shirt and work pants, tool belt hanging from his hips, methodically replacing one of the rotted boards she'd noticed yesterday. He worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times before, not looking up or pausing, just moving from one board to the next with practiced movements. Claire pulled on the same clothes she'd worn yesterday, ran her fingers through her tangled hair, and opened the door. The cold hit her immediately, sharper than any October morning in North Carolina, making her wish she'd thought to grab a jacket. The man looked up at the sound of the door, and Claire got her first clear look at him. He was probably late 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that was more weathered than handsome, the kind of face that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. His eyes were an unexpected light brown, almost amber in the morning sun, and when they met hers there was something careful in them, reserved but not unfriendly. "Morning," he said, setting down his hammer. "Didn't mean to wake you. Patricia asked me to fix this porch before you broke your ankle on it." "Oh." Claire wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did." He gestured at the board he'd just removed, showing her the soft, punky wood underneath. "This whole thing was about 2 weeks from collapse. I'm Ben Hargrove. I do maintenance for the school, carpentry work on the side. Claire Donovan." She almost said her married name, caught herself, felt a small jolt at the realization that she could be anyone here. Nobody knew her story. "I'm the new 4th grade teacher." "I know." He picked up another board, measuring it against the gap. "Patricia mentioned someone was moving into the trailer. You're from back east?" "North Carolina." Ben nodded like this confirmed something he'd already guessed. "Long way from home." "That's kind of the point." The words came out more honest than she'd intended, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of understanding that suggested he knew exactly what running away looked like. He didn't press, didn't ask questions, just went back to work on the porch. Claire stood there for another awkward moment, unsure if she should go back inside or stay, before retreating into the trailer's warmth. Through the window she watched him work, noticing things she hadn't before. The careful way he checked each board before committing to cutting it, the small notebook he pulled from his pocket to write something down, the thermos of coffee sitting on the porch railing that he sipped from between measurements. An hour later, when she emerged again to drive to the school, the porch was finished. Solid new boards, sanded smooth, fitting perfectly into the old frame, and sitting on the railing was a cardboard box she hadn't seen before. Inside were 3 heavy wool blankets, the kind you'd find at an army surplus store, clean but clearly used. No note, no explanation, just blankets, because somehow Ben Hargrove had noticed that the trailer was cold and that Claire probably hadn't thought to bring winter bedding from North Carolina. She saw him throughout that first week, always at a distance, always working, fixing a gutter on the school building, replacing a broken window, clearing fallen branches from the playground after a windstorm. He'd nod when he saw her, sometimes raise a hand in acknowledgement, but never approached or tried to make conversation. It should have felt standoffish, but somehow it didn't. It felt like he was giving her space to breathe, to settle, to figure out how to exist in this new place without the pressure of having to explain herself. The second week, Claire's car wouldn't start. It was a Saturday morning, and she'd planned to drive into town for groceries, but when she turned the key, there was just a clicking sound and nothing else. She sat there in the driver's seat, feeling panic rise in her chest, the kind of helpless frustration that came from being alone in an unfamiliar place, with no idea who to call or what to do. She was still sitting there 10 minutes later, trying not to cry, when Ben's truck pulled into the parking lot. He didn't ask what was wrong, just parked next to her, got out, and popped her hood without a word. 5 minutes later, he'd identified the problem, a corroded battery terminal, and fixed it with supplies from his toolbox. When Claire tried to thank him, tried to offer to pay him, he just shook his head. It's fine. Took 5 minutes. He started to walk back to his truck, then paused. If you need groceries, there's a decent store on the east side of town, cheaper than the touristy places downtown. I don't really know where anything is yet, Claire admitted. Ben considered this, then pulled out his phone and showed her a map, pointing out the store, a good coffee place, the library, a few other essentials. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of manual work. His phone screen cracked in one corner. He explained the directions in that same economical way he did everything. No wasted words, just useful information delivered without judgment. Over the following weeks, Claire began to notice a pattern. When her trailer's heating went out during the first real cold snap, Ben showed up within an hour of her mentioning it to Patricia, fixed it, and left before she could even offer him coffee. When she struggled to carry a box of teaching supplies from her car, he materialized from somewhere and carried it to her classroom without being asked. When the trailer's porch light burned out, and she couldn't figure out how to replace it in the dark, she came home from work the next day to find it already fixed. He never lingered, never asked for anything in return, never tried to turn these small acts of maintenance into opportunities for conversation or connection. But Claire found herself looking for him anyway, noticing when his truck was in the parking lot, feeling something that wasn't quite relief, but close to it when she'd see him working somewhere on the school grounds. There was something steadying about his presence, something that suggested competence and reliability without the need for performance or explanation. One afternoon in early November, Claire was sitting on her newly repaired porch, wrapped in one of the blankets Ben had left, grading papers and watching the mountains turn orange in the sunset. Ben came around the corner of the school building carrying a ladder, saw her, and stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You settling in okay?" It was the first personal question he'd asked her, and Claire felt something loosen in her chest. "I think so. It's different here." Different good or different bad? She considered this. Just different. I'm still figuring it out. Ben nodded, adjusted the ladder on his shoulder. Takes time. Getting used to a new place. He started to walk away, then added without turning around, "But you're doing fine, by the way. The kids in your class, they talk about you. They like you." And then he was gone, disappearing around the building, leaving Claire sitting there with an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the blanket. The invitation came in late November, written on a torn piece of lined paper and slipped under her trailer door. Claire found it when she got home from work, her arms full of groceries and her nose running from the cold that had settled over Ben like a physical presence. The handwriting was rough but legible. "There's a diner on Franklin called Ruby's. Good coffee, better pie. If you want company tomorrow night around 6, I'll be there. No pressure. Ben." Claire stood in her tiny kitchen holding the note, reading it 3 times to make sure she'd understood correctly. It wasn't quite an invitation to dinner. More like an offer, casual and low stakes. The kind of thing she could ignore without offense if she wanted to. But the truth was, she'd spent the last 6 weeks eating alone in the trailer, watching Netflix on her laptop, going through the motions of teaching and sleeping and existing without really living. The idea of sitting across from another human being, having a conversation that wasn't about lesson plans or parent conferences, felt both terrifying and necessary. She showed up at Ruby's at 6:15, deliberately late so she wouldn't seem too eager, and found Ben already there in a corner booth, wearing a clean flannel shirt and jeans that looked newer than his work clothes. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and was reading something on his phone, but he looked up when the bell above the door chimed and gave her a small nod that might have been relief. "You came," he said, as she slid into the booth across from him. "You said there was good pie." Best in Bend, he flagged down a waitress, an older woman with kind eyes who clearly knew him, and ordered 2 slices of Marionberry pie and a coffee for Claire, without asking what she wanted. When Claire raised an eyebrow, he shrugged. "Trust me on this one." The pie arrived, and it was, Claire had to admit, exceptional. Tart and sweet, and still warm, with a crust that flaked perfectly under her fork. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Ben said, "So, North Carolina to Oregon. That's a hell of a move." Claire set down her fork, tried to decide how much to say. In the end, she went with the truth. "I needed to get away from some things. Start over somewhere nobody knew me. Bad breakup? Bad marriage." The words came easier than she'd expected. "Found my husband with someone else. He'd been planning to leave for months, I just didn't know it. So I left instead." Ben took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "I know something about that. Not the cheating part, but the marriage falling apart part. Mine ended about 4 years ago. She wanted kids, a bigger house, a different life than the one I could give her. Tried to make it work for a while. But you can't fix something when only one person wants to fix it." There was something in the way he said it, matter of fact but with an undercurrent of old pain, that made Claire feel less alone. "Do you have kids?" "No. She remarried, had 2 kids with the new guy. Lives in Portland now. We're friendly, send Christmas cards, that kind of thing. Took a while to get there, though." "Does it get easier?" Claire heard herself ask. "Being on your own again?" Ben considered this, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. "Yeah, but not in the way you think. You don't stop missing what you had, or what you thought you had. You just get better at being yourself without it. At figuring out who you are when you're not part of a we anymore." They talked for 2 hours. About books, Claire's love of mystery novels, and Ben's preference for history and biography. About Bend, the way the town transformed in winter. How the locals could spot tourists immediately by their inadequate jackets. About their jobs, the satisfaction of teaching kids who actually wanted to learn. The meditative quality of working with wood and seeing something broken become whole again. Ben told her about growing up in a small town in Idaho, coming to Oregon for college and never leaving. Claire told him about North Carolina, about teaching at the same school for 8 years, about the strange grief of leaving behind a life that had never really belonged to her anyway. When the diner started to empty out, and the waitress began giving them pointed looks, Ben paid the check over Claire's protests and walked her to her car. The parking lot was dark except for one flickering streetlight, and their breath formed visible clouds in the December air. "This was nice," Claire said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Thank you for the invitation. Want to do it again?" Ben asked. "There's a used bookstore downtown I think you'd like. Maybe this weekend?" And so it began. A slow accretion of time spent together that felt nothing like dating, and everything like building something more solid. Ben showed her the bookstore, a cramped space that smelled like old paper and coffee, where they browsed in comfortable silence for an hour before comparing their finds. She chose 3 mystery novels. He picked up a biography of Teddy Roosevelt and a book about traditional woodworking techniques. Winter settled over Bend with a ferocity that shocked Claire even after Ben had warned her. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains that transformed the world into something otherworldly and strange. The trailer's heating system worked overtime, clanking and groaning through the nights while Claire burrowed under the blankets Ben had given her and listened to the wind howl through the pines. School closed for 2 days after a particularly heavy storm, and Claire found herself with time she didn't know how to fill, time that used to be swallowed by marriage and routine, and all the small compromises of sharing a life with someone. Ben called on the second snow day and asked if she wanted to learn how to split firewood. It seemed like an odd invitation, until he explained that his cabin, about 15 miles outside of town, was heated primarily by a wood stove, and he was behind on his winter prep. Claire said yes without thinking too hard about it, bundled herself into the winter coat she'd bought at a second-hand store, and met him in the school parking lot where his truck sat idling, exhaust visible in the frozen air. The drive took them up into the mountains on roads that made Claire's stomach clench with anxiety, narrow and winding with drops on either side that disappeared into white nothingness. Ben drove with casual confidence, one hand on the wheel, pointing out landmarks she couldn't see through the snow. His cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a small structure built from dark wood with a metal roof and smoke curling from the chimney. It looked like something out of a different era, isolated and self-sufficient, the kind of place someone came to when they wanted to disappear from the world. Inside was warmer than Claire expected. One large room that served as kitchen, living area, and workspace, with a loft bedroom visible above. Tools hung on the walls with careful organization, books lined shelves made from reclaimed wood. A wood stove in the corner radiated heat. Its door opened to reveal glowing coals. Everything was clean but lived in. Spare but comfortable. Exactly what she would have expected from someone like Ben. They spent the afternoon in the cold. Ben teaching her how to position logs, how to swing the maul with her whole body rather than just her arms, how to read the grain of the wood to find where it wanted to split. Claire's hands blistered inside the borrowed work gloves and her shoulders ached, but there was something deeply satisfying about the clean crack of wood splitting, about the pile of firewood growing beside her, about doing something physical and concrete after months of feeling like her entire life was built on uncertain ground. When they finally came inside, fingers numb and faces flushed from exertion, Ben made coffee, and they sat at his small kitchen table while feeling returned painfully to Claire's hands. They didn't talk much, just sat in that easy silence they'd developed over the past months, and Claire realized with a start that this was the most at peace she'd felt since before everything fell apart. Not happy exactly. Something quieter and more sustainable than happiness. Something like contentment. "Can I ask you something?" Ben said eventually, his coffee cup cradled between his palms. "And you can tell me if I'm overstepping." Claire nodded, suddenly nervous. "Do you think you'll go back? To North Carolina, I mean. Once you've had some time, gotten your feet under you." The question landed in the space between them like a stone dropping into still water. Claire stared at her coffee, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals, and tried to find an honest answer. "A few months ago, I would have said maybe, that this was temporary, that I was just hiding until I figured things out. But now," she looked up, met his eyes. "No, I don't think I will. There's nothing there for me anymore. Everything I thought I was building, it was all just an illusion." "And here?" Ben asked quietly. "Is this an illusion too?" Claire felt her breath catch. They'd been dancing around this for weeks, this thing growing between them that neither of them had named. These careful conversations and shared silences, the way her heart lifted when she saw his truck in the school parking lot, the way he'd started finding excuses to stop by the trailer with things he'd fixed or built, a new shelf for her books, a footstool for the high kitchen cabinets, a bird feeder he'd hung outside her window because she'd mentioned once that she missed hearing birds in the morning. "No," she said. "This isn't an illusion." Ben set down his coffee cup and reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid and real in a way that made Claire's eyes sting with unexpected tears. "I know you're still healing," he said. "I know you came here to start over, not to find someone. And I don't want to rush you or push for something you're not ready for. But Claire, I need you to know that this isn't casual for me. These past few months getting to know you, spending time with you, it's been the best thing that's happened to me in years." Claire felt something crack open inside her chest. Some hard protective shell she'd built around herself after finding Ryan with Melissa. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "of trusting someone again, of believing this is real and finding out I was wrong." "I know." Ben squeezed her hand gently. "I'm terrified too. But here's what I think. You didn't come to Bend looking for me. You came here looking for peace, for a life that was yours and nobody else's. And somewhere along the way, you found both. Maybe that's the universe telling you something. What's it telling me? That you don't have to keep running. That you can stay. That you can build something here that's real and solid and yours." He paused, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "With me if you want. But even if you don't want that, you can still stay. You belong here now, Claire. This is your home." The tears came then, sliding down Claire's face in hot tracks that she didn't bother to wipe away. But they weren't tears of grief or loss, or the hollow ache that had defined the past 6 months. They were something else entirely. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. The feeling of something fundamental shifting into place, like a bone that had been broken finally setting properly. "I want to stay," she whispered, "and I want it to be with you." Ben stood and pulled her up with him, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home to a place she'd never been before. Claire pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the smell of wood smoke and sawdust and coffee, feeling his heartbeat steady against her cheek. Outside, snow continued to fall in silence, covering the world in white, making everything clean and new. And for the first time since her entire life had collapsed, Claire felt like maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the warm cabin while the wood stove crackled and the world outside grew dark. Eventually, Ben pulled back just enough to look at her, his hand coming up to brush tears from her face with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a question and an answer all at once. And when Claire kissed him back, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not the desperate passion of early romance, but something deeper and more certain. The quiet knowledge that this person saw her, really saw her, broken pieces and all, and was choosing to stay anyway. Spring came to bend slowly, the snow retreating inch by grudging inch to reveal green underneath. Claire had been in Oregon for 6 months when Ben helped her move out of the trailer and into the small house they'd found together on the west side of town. It was nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom craftsman with a sagging porch that Ben promised to fix, and a backyard that was mostly weeds, but it was theirs. Truly theirs. Both their names on the lease, a choice they'd made together rather than something that had happened to them. They spent their first weekend painting the living room a warm cream color while rain drummed on the roof, and an old blues station played from Ben's paint-spattered radio. Claire had never painted a house with someone who asked her opinion and actually listened, who didn't override her color choices or tell her she was doing it wrong, who worked beside her in comfortable silence, occasionally reaching over to wipe a smudge of paint from her cheek, who made her laugh when he accidentally knocked over a paint tray and spent 20 minutes cleaning cream-colored paint off hardwood floors. In April, they adopted a dog from the local shelter, a mixed breed with uncertain parentage, and one ear that stood up while the other flopped down. Ben had been the one to suggest it, noticing how Claire would slow down whenever they passed the shelter on their evening walks, how she'd linger at the window watching the dogs in their kennels. They named him Scout, and he slept at the foot of their bed and followed Claire from room to room like he couldn't quite believe his luck at finding a permanent home. Claire's classroom at Cascade View had become something she was genuinely proud of. The walls were covered with student artwork and book reports, evidence of a year of teaching that felt more fulfilling than all her years in North Carolina combined. Her 4th graders were smart and curious, and occasionally challenging in ways that kept her sharp. Several parents had already asked if she'd be teaching 4th grade again next year, if they could request her classroom for their younger children. Patricia Holbrook had mentioned over coffee that Claire's contract would be renewed if she wanted it, that she'd become an essential part of the school's community. The garden was Ben's idea. He spent 3 weekends in May, turning over the weedy backyard, building raised beds from reclaimed lumber, showing Claire how to prepare soil and plan for different growing seasons. They planted tomatoes and peppers, herbs that would survive the short mountain summer, flowers that Claire chose purely because they were beautiful. Kneeling in the dirt beside him, her hands covered in soil, Claire felt connected to something fundamental and real in a way she'd never experienced in the manicured lawns and planned neighborhoods of her old life. On a Saturday in early June, Emma came to visit, flying out for a long weekend to see this new life her sister had built. Claire picked her up at the airport, nervous in a way she couldn't quite explain, worried that Emma would see how different everything was, and judge it somehow. But when Emma walked into the little house and met Ben, who'd made sure the guest room was perfect and had bought flowers for the kitchen table, she hugged Claire hard and whispered, "You look happy. Really happy. I haven't seen you look like this in years." They spent the weekend showing Emma around Bend, hiking an easy trail up to a waterfall, eating at Ruby's where Ben and Claire had gone on their first not-quite date. Emma and Ben got along easily, bonding over their shared love of terrible action movies and their willingness to gang up on Claire over her terrible sense of direction. On the last night, sitting on the back porch watching Scout chase moths in the twilight, Emma said, "You know, I was worried when you left. Thought maybe you were making a huge mistake, running away instead of dealing with things. But I was wrong. You weren't running away. You were running toward something. Toward this." Claire looked at Ben, who was reading beside her, his hand resting casually on her knee in that unconscious way they'd developed, at Scout, who'd finally given up on moths and was sprawled across their feet, at the house they'd painted together, the garden they were growing, the life they were building from nothing but intention and work, and the quiet decision to try again. "I know," she said. "I didn't know it when I left, But you're right. This was here waiting for me. I just had to be brave enough to find it. When Claire thought about Ryan now, which happened less and less frequently, she felt something that surprised her. Not anger or grief, or even lingering hurt. Gratitude. Because if he hadn't cheated, if he hadn't forced her to confront the fundamental brokenness of their marriage, she would still be in Greenfield teaching at the same school, living in a house that wasn't hers, waiting for a future that was never going to arrive. She would never have moved to Oregon, would never have met Ben, would never have discovered that she was capable of starting over, of building something real from the ground up, of loving again, without fear. Some endings, she'd learned, were actually beginnings in disguise. Some losses cleared space for something better to take root. And sometimes the worst thing that could happen was actually the catalyst for the best thing you'd never known you needed. If this story moved you, if you believe that sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we were really looking for, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. Because every week, I share stories like Claire's. Stories of women who faced devastation and found the strength to rebuild, who discovered that the end of one chapter can be the beginning of something extraordinary, who proved that true love appears not when we're searching for it, but when we finally have the courage to become the person we were always meant to be. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring these journeys together. Because if Claire's story teaches us anything, it's that it's never too late to start over, and the life you're meant to live might be waiting somewhere you never thought to look.